This channel is supported by TrueFire. TrueFire is an online library of lessons from some of my favourite players. There's thousands of lessons on there. You can use the promo code JNC40 to get 40% off of any of their courses. Okay, so I find it a little bit disappointing when some of the kind of bigger channels don't really seem to keep much interest in some products. So I think we're all used to the idea that at the launch of a product, we'll probably see a flurry of paid demos, but soon after that, you may never even see these devices on channels ever again. Now I get, in some ways, potentially, you know, it's about kind of paid promotion and about finding videos that will make more people interested or whatever, or perhaps, you know, the hype dies down on the product and it's not as easy to get views with something. Anyway, the Quad Cortex initially was met with a lot of excitement. These days, I don't tend to see many of the huge channels kind of talking about it, but I wanted to kind of do a recap on whether I think this is worth buying in 2023, because last night there came out a new kind of update on the firmware. As it happens, I don't think that firmware actually changes much to do with the Quad Cortex. I think the one before was actually the firmware update that for me meant that it was able to kind of compete in a more sensible fashion with most other devices. Now, the positives, I think the Quad Cortex probably has the best looper out of any modern modeler, except maybe Headrush, but I don't think they even make their full pedal board anymore. I think maybe they make the looper board, and in any case, I find like the UI of the Quad Cortex I would prefer to Headrush, and Headrush don't get that regular updates, and I think Neural DSP are probably committed to semi-regular updates. I think that's at least what they say. So in theory, it wouldn't take too long before the effects and amps in the Quad Cortex have caught up in number. Some of what's in there, especially with like the scene changes, I already think the Quad Cortex is ahead in quite a lot of respects. Other positives, it's got some cool effects in there like the freeze, which is really useful, I think. It's a bit of a specialist effect. And other positives as well, of course, in terms of size, your power to size ratio with Neural DSP is probably better than any other device out there. It's a really nice form factor, really compact, also, you know, capable of running 4 amps in one preset. There's not really anything else that can do that in this form factor. So lots of benefits in that way. Connectivity is good. In terms of whether the amp sounds are better than anything else, I think most people are sort of, I think these days on the fence with this sort of thing. I think there's probably a lot of people that have tried Neural DSP that maybe if you were a Fractal user, you'd be thinking, well, these tones aren't necessarily blowing anything out of the water. On the other hand, I hear people oftentimes saying that they couldn't really get great tones out of their Helix, that have had a better time with the Quad Cortex. So I think it sits nicely in the mix, essentially, of opinions where there's loads of people that are really happy with their Quad Cortex tones, but equally there's people that are getting great tones out of Helix, out of Fractal, out of Kemper and all that sort of stuff as well. What I think their real niche is, though, is that they sit in this unique space for the moment where you can do modeling on here as well as captures, and I think people, would either like to see a way smaller Kemper, or would like to see on the Helix Fractal devices the ability to create captures easily. I think that would be a benefit. The captures on this generally, I think people find to be pretty appealing, and those are pretty easy to create and quite quick. They take about 5 minutes. Relatively straightforward. The on-screen interface is really useful for walking you through the capture process, and I think the end result is pretty decent as well. Loads of people out there really like that capture unit. So I think that is the real kind of key to this, is that although there may be kind of gaps within their particular amount of amp models and stuff, and while Fractal have the upper hand in terms of overall quality and quantity of amps, the ability to kind of get in there and just capture pedals, amps and blend captures and all that sort of stuff, I think does give the Quad Cortex a bit of an edge at the moment that has not been really tackled by anyone else yet. There are a couple of downsides to the Neural DSP Quad Cortex at the moment. One of those would be there's a lack of desktop editor still, so this could give you back problems if you're a person who likes to keep this on the floor. There's no way to really get around it. Although it's great, I think, for editing on the device itself, if you have it on the tabletop, a lot of people do rely on desktop editors, and this doesn't have one. Another downside would be that one of the key things that I think people were interested in when the Quad Cortex was first announced is that there was going to be plugins ported to these. So the things that we really knew Neural DSP for at the time, things like Pliny, the plugin, Nolly. Latterly, we've got things like the Jim Henson's son plugin. We got Rabia Massad's, as well as things like the Tone King. None of that is really... there's no firm date on when that might arrive, so we've got no idea really. As the other slight negative is that flexibility of foot switching isn't really there yet. You can't customize specific foot switches like you could on, say, the Helix or on the Fractal stuff. You can't label them, you can't change the colors on them. So although this hybrid mode has come along and made it significantly better than it was a day ago, it's still, I think, a little bit behind in terms of being able to really customize and create your own sort of thing to gig with, and label up or change the LED colors. These sorts of things that I think would be really useful, particularly if you're putting more than one thing on a foot switch. I'd want to create a label for that and say wet, dry, bright, or whatever it is doing. It would make it a lot easier. Overall, I think one of a tiny negative, that the actual power supply that comes with the unit is still quite flimsy. I think they've been talking about trying to find a better replacement, but there's nothing on the horizon for that either. So who knows? So the future, I think there's huge potential in this unit. Whether it ever realizes it, I'm not totally sure. It seems like the pace of change has slowed a little bit from update to update. I think that might be partly to do with supply chain issues and having their own things that they've had to deal with internally. There is potential here, I think. It's a very powerful unit for its size, and I think the sounds in there, for me, I think are really great and easily kind of up there with most of the other modelers, if not easier in some ways to get your desired tones. I'm going to do a preset build here. If you liked the tones in the intro, leave a comment below, and I'll pop that into the cloud for you if you want to try that. I think it's really decent to build tones on. I think at the moment it's a little bit expensive for the amount of models you get, and it's still somewhat lacking in effects compared to the real top of the tree stuff. But I do think they've made a real competitor to the Kemper, for example, which I think at the moment it looks to me like Kemper need to be thinking about doing something, because creating presets from scratch on the Quad Cortex I really like. You can also capture like you can do on the Kemper. So in a way, the Kemper's market share, I imagine, has taken a little bit of a hit from the Quad Cortex. At the moment, I still think Fractal are making a more mature unit and have far more tweakability, and it's far more mature and ready to go. For me personally, I think the Helix as well has abundantly more effects and more flexible unit, and more kind of gig ready in terms of being able to switch your layouts and stuff, as well as having, you know, lots more special effects and stuff like that. Whether you dig the amp models as much, I'm not sure that there's anything that I couldn't replicate on the Helix that I could do in the Quad Cortex. It would just be a matter of time and knowing how to tweak. And if you're, you know, haven't got loads of time, then potentially you might get quicker results with the Quad Cortex. In terms of overall sound quality as well, the Fractal would have it beaten in terms of oversampling, and I think the Helix 2, from what I know internally, you know, for instance, the Fractal stuff oversamples at 16 times or 8. Quad Cortex is certainly less than that. So in theory, when you're playing really high gain drive tones, you possibly might hear a bit more aliasing with the Quad Cortex, but I don't actually hear that. It's just a thing that I know that in theory some people would hear. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'm going to go on to the preset build now. So I think there's potential in the Quad Cortex still, and it's much like it's been the whole time. There's definitely, you can see a huge upside to it, but whether that is really achieved in the long run, I'm not too sure. At the moment, they are still, I think, a little bit behind in terms of effects, a little bit behind in terms of flexibility, and a little bit behind in terms of, you know, there are missing features like desktop editors, and things that were going to make the Quad Cortex unique have not been realized yet, in my opinion. So a little bit expensive for what it is right now. Could be great at some point.
So I wanted to show you what it's like to build presets on here now, because the update is slightly different in some ways to what you might have seen from older reviews. So we've now got, this is the latest amp added here. We've also got an IR loader, if you've got IRs that you like to use. So for example, we've got an IR here, and how this works: choose IR file. Here's one that I use, and that's how that works. And an IR shows up like that. I do still really think that the cab block still, I think, is one of the better ones in the modeling world. I'd say this is a reason to be a fan of the Quad Cortex. So let's just pull up Dynamic 57 and Dynamic 421. I'm going to move that off center a bit like that. So we've got our clean tone here. We've got our 5-way sliders as well on this. This is a Mesa Boogie style amp. That seems to sound pretty good straight away. One of the benefits of the Quad Cortex, I think, is that it does generally sound pretty good quite easily. You don't necessarily have the granularity of editing that you'd get in other devices, but what you do have, I think, sounds pretty good. So here's a delay. Okay, one of the new things we've got is this hybrid mode. So what I'm going to do is set up the stomps to be down here, right? So I need to just assign these to, so I'm going to have the delay on G. Press the target footset to assign. That's on G now, that's a delay. There's a reverb, that'll be on H. H. Okay, so now we've got our delay and reverb. I'm also going to stick a looper on here. I think this is one of the best features of the Quad Cortex. If I move this down here even, what we can do with this is just set it up to be parameters unassigned from the grid on here, so multi, and then you can put it anywhere and it still works as a loop. I'm going to assign that to foot switch F. Okay, so now we've got a looper down here doing our loopy stuff. We could also stick in a freeze, but what I'm going to do is just set up on snapshot B, scene B. What I'm going to do is just turn this one off, so we hold and bypass, and I'm going to move this cab over to here, and then set up a different amp. Where are you? Guitar. We can't. So what I'm going to have to do is put this in series, so that should go on to lane row 3, I guess. Let's put this on row 4 and split it up here, over here. Right, then this one goes to multi outputs, and then I can put the delay and reverb down here, and that should free me up some juice to put in channel 3 of John's amp for my heavy tones. Let's just bypass it to start with, then we want it on this, then okay, need a gate here now, so we hold here, on, yeah, on for this. Okay, so now we've got our lead tone. Okay, then for C, I need to bypass this one. Cancel, bypass. Then A, bypass it as well. So we got our clean. Save, how do we just save that now? Guitar. Save. And then for my lead tone, what I'm going to do is bring in an EQ like this. Parametric. I'm going to bring in a high cut. And we're going to bring up, so now we've got a boost for that, so I'm going to turn it off by default, off, then on for the lead snapshot, which is not 3, is it? So off for B, on. Save, So we've just set up in, I guess, 8 minutes. I need to get these going. So off for that. This one off as well. Rhythm, clean, and lead. And we could, of course, make adjustments, for instance, to this mix on a per scene basis. So I'm going to turn down that for that. So in general, pretty easy to build, pretty good sounding presets, I believe. Also, we could chuck on a freeze here if we wanted to in the morph section. Freeze, and I'm going to assign that to E, which is already on. So then we could, in our clean mode, set up a really cool tone for sort of and of course, on top of that, you've also got, I guess, the capture side of things. So if we just bypass this and bypass this and bypass this, what I think is cool about this is that you can, with relative ease, just capture an existing sound. So we could look at my captures, for example. You could go in and, for instance, pull up something like this, and capturing this took 5 minutes. Turn down the reverb for that part as well. So we've got a relatively easy way to dial in. Or at least recall existing captures for that kind of thing. So that's what it's like to use the unit. It's of course also got an audio interface, which is pretty decent. Yeah, relatively easy to use. Some limitations, but I think, yeah, that's my opinion on it anyway.